as an intro, my name is Erin Harlan. I'm part of the product marketing team here at Smartsheet. And today we are here to talk all about sheets. So as you may be aware, Smartsheet is a collaborative work management platform made up of a bunch of different pieces, including sheets, reports, dashboards, automated actions. But today we're really going to focus on sheets and talk about some best practices to build your sheet effectively, because your sheet is where all your data lives in Smartsheet, and it's really the heart of a lot of your work. So we're going to define some things about your audience and your process before building your sheet to help you set it up effectively. We're also going to talk about how columns drive functionality in Smartsheet, which is really, really important. We're also going to talk about how hierarchy can be used to structure and organize rows. We're going to also review some best practices for using color and conditional formatting. And we're going to understand the different views available on your sheet and understand how to use them to take advantage of those functionalities. So before we get started, I want to just talk about a couple things to think about before you even start building your sheet. Again, the sheet is where all your data is organized, structured, and managed in Smartsheet. So thinking about some important things, including your process, your goals, your roles, and your visibility before you start building will help ensure that you're putting in the appropriate things that you need for that sheet to function effectively. So the first thing is you do want to understand, what is that work process that I'm trying to build in this sheet in Smartsheet? What are those steps in that process in order? And is my process the most effective the way it is today, or are there things I may want to change about that process? So really clearly define some of those things in your process that you want to put into Smartsheet first. Also, clearly defining what's my end goal. How do I define success? What am I doing this process for? What's my final deliverable? Will also ensure that I'm putting in all the pieces to my sheet or to my process appropriately to meet that goal. The third thing is understanding the roles in my process. Who are all the different people that I'm going to be working with in this process? Are they internal people? Are they external people? And then finally thinking about, once I understand those stakeholders, what do all those different stakeholders need to be successful in this process? Do I have executives or clients or customers that I need to report out to? Maybe different stakeholders need different views. So sort of identifying my process, my goals, my roles, and my visibility before I start building my sheet will help me determine what are the items that I need to put in my sheet to be successful. Once I've defined those things, I can go ahead and jump into Smartsheet and start building. In Smartsheet, I'm going to go to my Home tab first, because there are a couple different ways that I can create new work in Smartsheet. Number one, I can just create from a blank sheet. So if I hit my Create New button on the Home tab, I can create a new blank sheet, which is a blank grid. I also have the ability to import data from another application. So if I've started collecting some data from Excel or Microsoft Project or a Google Sheet, something like that, I can import that into a new sheet in Smartsheet so that I don't have to manually copy and paste all of that data. And then, of course, the third way that I can create a sheet is I can start from a template. And if I click this plus tab here at the top, that takes me into our Solution Center, which has hundreds of templates and even template sets or mini solutions that I can use, so I don't have to start from scratch. It actually has a predefined format that I can then take and manipulate and customize to meet my needs. So actually, for the sake of getting started, I have actually used a template here, which is our website project with Gantt and dependencies, and this is a template in that Solution Center. And I've pre-filled out information that we can work with for this demo. Now you'll notice I have a lot of different columns kind of already set up in this sheet. And the first thing, and probably the most important thing to understand about building a sheet in Smartsheet, if there's one thing you take away from this webinar, it's understanding what makes Smartsheet different from other tools that you may use. And one of those key things is that Smartsheet has what are called smart column types, all these different column types that do different types of work. And it's really important to become familiar with those column types and use them appropriately to drive other functionality in Smartsheet. Now I can see all the column types in Smartsheet. If I hover over any of my columns, notice my columns all have names, which I can of course customize, and over any column there's a little drop-down menu to the column menu, and it allows me, if I'm the owner or the admin, I can insert a new column, I can delete, I can rename. Notice also at the bottom there's the edit column properties, and I can see what type of column this is. And actually I'm going to go ahead and insert a new column just for grins so I can see what that looks like, and I can see all the different column types available in Smartsheet. So the default column type is a text and number column. This is just like Excel or Google Sheets where it's just text and numbers. We also have a special column type called a contact list column type. Contact list column types are really valuable when I'm collaborating with other people, because a contact list column includes not only the name, but also the associated email address. Notice I've already got a contact list column type here, and when I hover over any of those contacts, notice it gives me the name as well as their email address as whatever other profile information. And this is pulling from both my corporate contact list, which is managed by my system administrator, as well as my personal contacts, which are up here under my account settings. So I also have a personal contact list where I can include people who may not be part of my Smartsheet account. Maybe I'm collaborating with customers or vendors or suppliers or partners. If I add those people to my personal contact list, then I can of course also add them to a contact list column type. And it's a best practice to use a contact list column type because it has this email associated to it as well as this other information. That helps me drive things like collaboration functionality or automated actions or alerts. All of those things are going to be driven by this information. So best practice is always use that contact list column type when you are working with other people in a sheet. And let's go back and look at, again, those other column types. We also have date columns. Actually, I've got some date columns also in here that I've colored green. We'll talk about color in a minute. And notice for the date column types, they have this date picker on them. Now, date columns are how Smartsheet recognizes calendar data. So again, if I'm using anything that involves a date, when I'm using a date in Smartsheet, it's a best practice to use a date column because, again, this drives other functionality like reporting or calendar view or reminders or some of those other critical pieces of my greater work process. So again, if I'm using anything that involves dates, best practice is to use a date column. And notice I can put as many date columns in as I want. I've got a start date and a finish date. I also have symbols column types, and I'm just going to go ahead and insert another symbol so you can just see. I'll call this one health. We have a variety of different symbols available in Smartsheet. And symbols are great as visual indicators of some of the work that's happening in my sheet. And you notice I've got stars, and I've got flags, and I've got arrows, and I've got balls, and I've got priority items. So I have a lot of different symbols, and it's a great tool to use a symbol in your sheet because it, again, gives you that quick visual indicator, which helps people understand some of the things that are happening. So maybe I'm going to put in a health icon. I'll do red, yellow, green. And then what's nice is then I can come in, and of course I can change those colors here on my sheet to apply to whatever the health is of particular items. Notice I also have a flag column in here already. This is another symbol, an at-risk flag, and of course I can turn that on or off. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I also have drop-down list column types. Drop-down list columns are where you can set a custom drop-down list. So I want people to only select specific values. I want them to pick one of these 4 statuses. Or I can also have, if I have dependencies enabled, which is a project management functionality, and I do that by editing my project settings. If I have that dependencies enabled box checked on my sheet, then I get these 2 special columns called duration and predecessors, which essentially allow me to build relationships between tasks and identify how long a specific task is taking. So I'll show you that how that works a little bit more in a minute. But these are essentially all the different column types that we have available in Smartsheet. You'll notice there's also this one special column, and this column type exists in every single sheet. It's called the primary column. And you know it's the primary column because the column name is bolded, and you've got this little eye icon showing me it's the primary column. And the primary column is special. So again, column types sort of define all the data in your sheet, or the data types, and your rows are actually the data themselves. The primary column serves a very specific purpose. Number one, it labels all of the rows in your sheet. So in this case, I'm calling it task name because in this website development project, I've got a bunch of different tasks that need to happen in a specific order. And so I'm going to actually put what's that task name in my primary column. And what's nice about this is then when I switch to other views, that primary column always is going to exist and will always show up, and it's actually going to label what that row of information is about. So when you're thinking about setting up your sheet, it's also, again, important to understand the primary column because it labels all your rows. And that label is going to show up in card view, in your calendar view, in other places, in reports. So when you're thinking, again, about how you set up your sheet, as we talked about, it's important to sort of understand your process first so you can think about what data do I want to put in that primary column that's going to be most effective for my process. The other thing that the primary column allows us to do is to build hierarchy or parent-child relationships where I can collapse or expand relationships between tasks. And this is really handy for organizing and structuring all the rows that I have in my sheet. And notice I can build multiple levels of hierarchy. I've got this one that's a level down that's underneath this one, that's underneath this one. So I can build as many hierarchies as I want to help structure and organize my rows and help segment the rows within my sheet. To build hierarchy, it's very simple. Again, it's done in the primary column. So say, for example, I have these tasks here and I want them all to fall under overview and sitemap. I can just go ahead and select those cells that I want to be indented, and then I can simply come up to the toolbar and there's an indent button. And now those rows are indented underneath overview and sitemap. I can collapse or expand that relationship, and those tasks are now tied together. So even if I move overview and sitemap, say I move it now below wireframes, for example, notice those tasks are still tied together. And if I move it back or undo, it will go back to that location, but those items are always going to be tied together. Now, another thing what's great about hierarchy, and this kind of transitions me into this talk about color. We just talked about, just to kind of recap, we talked about our different column types and how it's important to understand our column types. We can always change the column type by coming up to our column drop-down list and edit column properties. We can change the column type, we can edit it. We can also insert new columns, delete columns, etc. if we are the owner or the admin on our sheet. And then the same with rows. And our hierarchy allows us to indent or structure or organize our rows. Color is also a best practice in our sheet to give those quick visual indicators to people and also to help set expectations, because oftentimes we're not working on a sheet by ourselves, we're working with other people, and we want to clearly help people understand what information goes where. So, for example, I've colored my date columns a light green color, and I simply do that by selecting the column and coming over to my toolbar to my formatting and changing the background color. And especially if I'm coloring an entire column, I like to use these super light colors because then I can see the text through them. But what's nice about this is that it gives me, I can clearly see, oh, these are my date columns. Okay, I know I need to handle these a certain way. Or maybe I want to color a specific section of my sheet. Like, hey, Bob, all the things in blue are things that I need you to fill out. Or, hey, all the things in yellow are the things for this other team to participate in. So using color to break up different sections of your sheet or to color different columns or different sections is a really great practice. I can also use it effectively in my hierarchy. Notice I can collapse all. Under my primary column, I have the option to collapse all, and I can collapse all the hierarchy. And notice how I have actually used color to identify all of my different phases of my project. And if I wanted to change the color of those, of course, I can collapse them, and then I just easily select those rows by holding down my Shift key here. And of course, I can change the color. Maybe I want to make them, let's make them purple instead. Okay, so in either way, if I go ahead and expand everything again, notice I can tell, scrolling down, which are my different sections. And if I need to collapse an entire section, I have that color coding to identify. Maybe I also want to, let's go ahead and collapse all. Notice how this makes it really easy to kind of see the next level of things. Maybe I also want parents that also have other things below them to be bolded or what have you. But using my color and my formatting, I can easily visually see what different breakdowns I have within my sheet. Notice also one of the other things that's unique about hierarchy is, especially if I'm using a project sheet with dependencies enabled, my parent rows in a hierarchy become summary rows of anything below it. So notice I have planning, design, development, final site launch, all are part of web project development. If I go ahead and I indent these, notice how some information automatically fills in. And of course, I can customize my formatting here, but it's automatically going to fill out things like my start and my finish date, my percent complete, my duration, because the hierarchy is going to do that work for me in a project sheet with dependencies enabled. So again, hierarchy also serves some other functions as well when I'm thinking about setting up my sheet. Now we talked about colors for background. We talked about coloring maybe different layers of my hierarchy. Symbols are also great for color. But another thing to think about when I'm selecting colors in my sheet is I want to be very intentional about the different colors that I'm using. And it's a best practice to save alert colors like red or yellow. Save those for important things like alerts, or I want to know if something's at risk or past due. I want to save those colors as sort of highlights to important things within my sheet. Maybe I don't want to make the background all red because I want red to mean something significant in my sheet. So of course I can do that with symbols. A couple other ways that I can do that, or I can create what are called conditional formatting rules. And this icon here in my toolbar called conditional formatting allows me to actually create rules on my sheet whereby the formatting will change when certain criteria are met. So for example, I have a rule here that if the at-risk flag is turned on, if risk is flagged on, then I want my text to be red, and I want my bars, which we'll talk about more in a second, to be red as well. So notice now when I turn on that alert, okay, maybe this particular item is going to be listed as at risk. Notice how it also turns all of my text red. And I'm using that as a quick visual indicator. Here, I'll do another one so you can see down here below. And then I can see that everything has turned red, that I have a quick visual indicator of those items that are at risk. Another thing that I can do is I can turn on my highlighter. So notice next to the conditional formatting button, there's also this button called Highlight Changes. And when I turn on the highlighter, highlight changes, by the way, is a global functionality. So anybody with editor permissions or higher on my sheet can turn this off and on. And everybody who's shared to the sheet will see my highlights. And highlights just give me, again, that quick visual indicator of all the things that have changed. So I can select since the last hour, the last day. My personal favorite is since I last viewed the sheet. So when I have this turned on, it's going to highlight for me in yellow, and of course I can change that color. Maybe I don't want it to be yellow, maybe I want it to be green, or maybe I want it to be purple. I like yellow, again, because it's an alert color, right? It stands out to me as, hey, pay attention to this information. These are things that have changed. And I can easily see then all those things that have changed since I last viewed the sheet. And same thing, if I have my sheet shared to other people, they'll also see anything that has been changed. Just kind of recapping, we talked about the different column types and how there are several different column types available in our sheets, and they do manage different types of data and they do drive some different functionality. We talked about building hierarchy and how that's important for structuring rows. We talked about including symbols and color and some of those tips and tricks about color. The last thing I want to talk about is the fact that we have different ways that I can view my sheet in Smartsheet. So the default view, which is what we're looking at now, is called the grid view, which essentially is my columns and rows structure, right? And actually I wanted to highlight before I jump into that, notice there are a couple little skinny columns here to the left. And these columns also always exist on my sheet. One is called attachments. It's this little paper clip and allows me to attach files to a row. I can also attach files to the entire sheet over here on the right. Or comments, which allows me to make comments or add messages that can be shared again with other people who are shared to my sheet. And so these little columns also exist in my grid view across all of my sheets as well. I wanted to highlight that. But again, grid view is my default view here. That's what we're looking at. But if I select my views drop down here in my toolbar, notice there's actually 4 different ways that I can view this sheet. And it's the same data, it's just taking that same data and looking at it a different way, which may be more valuable depending again upon my process. So I've got the Gantt view, the card view, and the calendar view. And again, what's important, these different views are also driven by the column types in my sheet. So depending on what column types I've built will depend on whether or not I can use some of these views. So let's take a look at a couple of them. So first off, I'm going to go to the bottom here and I'm going to look at the calendar view. And the calendar view essentially takes all of my data and puts it into a calendar. And again, this is driven by date column. So as long as I have at least one date column in my sheet, I can view my data in a calendar. And this is really valuable if I just want to see how these different tasks overlap over time. This little gear icon in the upper right-hand corner is my settings. So I've got it displaying my range of dates from my start to my finish. But maybe I just want to look at my finish dates for all these different tasks. I can go ahead and change the calendar view, and again, it's just going to show me those tasks. And notice again my conditional formatting rules. Remember we changed that bar to also be red if something's at risk. That will show up on my calendar view as well. And the label, of course, for all of these items in my calendar view is whatever I have in my primary column. So my task name is going to be what's showing up in my primary column. I can click on that item in the calendar view and I can go ahead and I can edit that information. I can add attachments and comments and I can see all of that directly from the calendar view. But again, this is really handy if I want to look at a monthly view of all the different things happening within my process. The next view, which is also driven by date columns, is the Gantt view. And I'm going to drop to this one. And the Gantt view is a timeline view. And again, it requires 2 date columns. It requires your start and your finish date. And it gives me an actual timeline of all of these different pieces of information within my project sheet. And I can zoom in or I can zoom out across my timeline. Notice my conditional formatting rules, because I changed the bar, will also change the color of the bars. Are my Gantt chart. That's a great way to change colors. I can also right click and manually change the color, but I like creating rules to automatically do that for me. And this is also where those 2 special column types we mentioned, the duration and the predecessors column, become valuable, because these columns really work directly with your Gantt chart in order to define your duration as well as your relationships between those tasks. So for example, this task here goes from June 20th to June 22nd, and that's 3 days. Maybe I want to make it 4 days. I can actually go ahead and I can change my duration. Notice it's going to automatically change what my Gantt chart looks like. It's also going to change my dates in my sheet here because those columns are related to each other. And notice I have a relationship between these tasks. I can also click and drag. Maybe I want to build another relationship or a dependency. And when I do that, it's going to change what my timeline looks like because now these items are related to each other. So the Gantt view is really great, especially if I'm doing, say, traditional waterfall project management, and I want to be able to see all those different tasks in that waterfall timeline, and I want to see how they're related to each other, and I want to build those dependent relationships. That's where I would use my Gantt view. The last view is what's called the card view. And card view, unlike my Gantt and my calendar views, which are driven by my date columns, my card view is driven by different column types. And card view is driven by 3 different column types, either a contact list column type, symbol column type, or by a drop-down list column type. So as long as I have one of those 3 column types in my sheet, I can use the card view. And card view is really helpful in terms of organizing and prioritizing different pieces of work and really giving a visual display to that and making it a lot more visual for my team. So for example, maybe this back-end wireframes is not started. I can just go ahead and move it over. Maybe client view is on track. and maybe this item here moves to complete. I can simply click and drag and move things around, and what that's going to do is it's going to change my drop-down value in my sheet. Same thing if I go to my health column. Okay, I've only got a few things that are assigned to different health items. I can go ahead and put them in whatever color I've identified. Notice again my at-risk flag is flagged, and it's going to color the bar on my card view as well because of my conditional formatting rule. So I can easily organize and prioritize. Maybe I want to see what tasks are assigned to different people. It gives me that quick visual indicator. I can also see levels of hierarchy if I have hierarchy in my sheet in my card view. So I can actually flip through my different levels of hierarchy if I want to see that, or I can view all the levels. I can double click on a card and I can go in and edit all the information there, including adding attachments and comments, and I can see all of that really quickly and easily. So again, depending on what I'm trying to accomplish, I may want to look at my sheet in a different view. Grid view is sort of the default view, and it's where I can set up my column types, but it may not necessarily be the best view for my project or my process. Now let's go back. I want to just kind of highlight and recap again. We talked about a lot of different things. I want to just recap what we talked about. So first thing we talked about is before you start building your sheet, make sure you think about your process, your goals, who's involved, and what visibility those people need, because that's going to then help you define what column types do I need to build in my sheet, what information do I need to have included, what steps do I need, etc. Second, it's important to make sure you're using the appropriate column types to drive functionality. So if I have date information, I want to make sure I'm using a date column, because that way then I can flip it to a calendar, or I can flip it to a Gantt chart. Or if I am assigning tasks to people, I want to make sure I'm using that contact list column type, because it's going to have an email address there. So then I can send all of those people a notification about what's happening with the sheet. Or I can flip to a card view and I can see who's got different tasks assigned to them. And then of course the third thing we talked about was using hierarchy. Hierarchy is really valuable when we're structuring or organizing our rows. We can basically build relationships between our rows. It also helps us organize and structure if we've got a lot of rows in our sheet. And hierarchy also gives us some of that special parent row functionality, that roll-up functionality that we saw in certain types of sheets with dependencies enabled. Definitely important is to make your sheet visual. Use images, use symbols, use colors, use formatting, use the different views to most effectively manage your work. Also, as we talked about, using those light background colors in different columns or in different sections of your sheet helps clearly define those sections and helps really set expectations for different people who are working together with you on your sheet. Also, it's a best practice to reserve red and yellow for conditional formatting or alerts. Again, those are alarm colors, red and yellow, so I might want to save those for just my highlight changes, or for something at risk or overdue. I might want to set a conditional formatting rule to turn the color red or yellow based on certain criteria. And then last but not least, start simple and then validate it before adding complexity. So ideally, once you create your sheet, you want to go ahead and share it with the rest of your team or whoever else you're working with. You're not going to be working alone. So make sure that all of your formatting and structuring is easy to follow and that everybody understands what different things mean. So if you're using a symbols column, for example, you may want to tell everybody, hey, here's what my different color balls mean, or here's what my arrows mean, or here's what my flags mean. And make sure everybody understands those things. And you can always, of course, add complexity to your sheet as you go, but best practice is to start simple and get everybody onboarded, and then you can, of course, continue to format it as you go through your process. If you're interested in learning more about Sheets, learning more about Smartsheet in general, I would encourage you to join one of our training classes. We have a variety of different wonderful training offerings, from virtual online to self-paced to classroom training, or we even have custom on-site training. We can come and do some trainings for your team. So if you're interested in learning more about Smartsheet or taking some additional classes, check out our training page at smartsheet.com/training. Thanks so much for joining today's webinar on building better sheets. We hope this was informative, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar.